hunt for the world's greatest sports car. So far, 2 German cars have made the shortlist, but plenty of British cars got our experts' blood racing too.
There were so many iconic British sports cars of that era. I would say I'm going to go for an Aston Martin, and actually there's a few Aston Martins that you could chuck into this one, but I'm going to say the DB5.
You could probably argue that the Lotus Elan is deserving of being in this list.
The Elan, beautifully designed and beautifully made, but it's not an Aston Martin DB5. I mean, come on, if that's good enough for James Bond, it's good enough for us.
After much debate, there was one few could let slip through their fingers.
It's such a beautiful car, just the fact that the bonnet goes on for miles.
It looks great, it goes quickly, and still today, probably one of the best sports cars that we ever created.
It is so pretty, it makes me want to cry.
It's the Jaguar E Type.
Boom! That is the greatest British car ever made. Probably.
In 1961, we revealed to the world a car that was to epitomise the spirit of the 60s, the E Type.
It is the most beautiful car that's ever been made.
You could be the biggest car hater on the planet. If you stand next to an E-Type Jaguar, that car captures you.
There's nothing that comes close. It's perfection. It is absolute perfection. And that's so hard to get.
Sophisticated, sublime, beautiful lines and acres of bonnet. This car also had performance and handling to match. Still to this day, this is a sports car to be reckoned with.
We owe this debt of beauty to a design and mathematical genius who learnt his trade during World War II at Bristol Aviation, working on the Blenheim and Beaufighter planes. His name was Malcolm Cele. This aeronautical background taught him to produce mathematically calculated curves so perfectly aerodynamic, he started a revolution in car design.
Any sports car centres around performance, doesn't it? So part of that comes from the engine, but another huge chunk of that comes from the aerodynamics, how slick it is, how quickly and efficiently it can slip through the air. Malcolm Cele, an aerodynamicist himself, would have set out how he wanted it to look. So everyone else on the design team would have had to fit in to his aerodynamic package.
Malcolm's mathematical curves created an object of beauty and a legacy. But how did it perform? Shall we ask our ex-Formula One driver?
I've been lucky to drive 21 different Formula One cars across various eras, but I was also lucky to race the E-Type Jag. It was a lot of fun. You know, you could get it to dance on the throttle. The steering feel was predictable. It immediately gave you this comfort to want to go faster and faster and find the limits.
The E-Type wasn't just a revolution in car design, it was also an evolution in engineering. It was so well designed, Cele's E-Type could be produced faster and in greater numbers than its rivals, like the Aston Martin DB4 and the Ferrari 250 GT. In 1962, each week, as many as 150 came off the production line in Coventry. At £2,200, it costs 3 times less than a Ferrari. Still reassuringly expensive, however, as that was the same price as the average British house.
The secret of the E-Type's success was it looked better than anything else on the planet. And then they weren't that expensive. If you own a moderately successful plumbing firm, you could nip down the road to Jaguar and buy one.
The E-Type was a car with that classic combination: style, performance, and realistic price.
That overall package at a very affordable price, I mean, how clever is that?
The glamorous but affordable E-Type became the ultimate fashion icon of the swinging 60s, symbolising the rise of the self-made celebrity. The Jaguar E Type was sold to the rich and famous pop stars, rock stars and even football players. The most famous in England at the time was George Best, played for Manchester United. And when he sold his E-Type Jaguar, one of the complaints from the person that bought it was all over the headliner was these pop marks. And George had to explain that was the heel of stiletto shoes from all the girls that he'd had in the car. And they're feet on the ceiling, so you can guess what he was doing. The sexy 60s E-Type, a British icon. But our next sports cars to battle for the title of the world's greatest comes from the land of the rising sun and split opinion. But which one is it?
Supra. It's the Supra.
I'm not 100% sure about that.
The Supra Mark IV, an absolute god of the 90s. This thing was capable of 190 miles per hour. This was an absolute weapon.
The fact that I saw these cars in computer games and watched them in films when I was growing up, and then when I got older, I had the opportunity to work on one. As a car customiser, the Mark IV Supra is one of the ultimate cars to customise. We did one, and it was awesome.
The Supra, what a disaster area of a car that is. Awful. Has it got anything going for it at all? The only thing going for it is I don't own one and I can't see one right now. That's the only thing I can think of.
So the Supra didn't make the shortlist. But another Japanese car did, because people just couldn't get enough of it. It's the world's best-selling two-seater roadster, the Mazda MX-5.
I love the MX-5. I have a Mark I MX-5 and I think it's a fantastic car. It makes me a better driver.
I think the key ingredient that makes the MX-5 so wonderful is that it is fun. It is fun to look at, it is fun to be in, it is fun to be a passenger in.
Little roundabout. That's what it's all about. The throttle, the open road, wind in your hair, bugs in your teeth, freezing cold, but who cares? Because I'm having fun.
The Mazda MX-5 is the perfect sports car. They handle brilliantly, they drive brilliantly, they are fantastic to own and operate, and at one time I had the world's biggest private collection.
You want one that goes vroom every single time, and that's what the MX-5 did. And it did it really well, and it went well enough, and it handled well enough, and it sounded right, and they went a lot of money. You know, for that, I love it.
The affordability of the MX-5 meant sports cars had come of age. It changed the rule book on who could own them.
I think there's one car more than any other that's done more to democratise the ownership of sports cars to everyone, and that's the Mazda MX-5.
It suddenly meant that this huge demographic of people who had a little bit of spare money to buy a toy for them to play with over the weekend could now afford one.
So where did the idea of this affordable, beautifully handling sports car come from? It's not the 911 or the E-Type. In fact, it's all down to a fateful meeting. Legend has it, back in 1979, American journalist Bob Hall interviewed Mazda's head of R&D, Kenichi Yamamoto, and dropped into the conversation that he loved British roadsters of the 60s, cars like the MGB and the Lotus Elan, but he hated their unreliability and said Mazda, well, they could do better. It was like a red rag to a bull.
The MX-5 is a great example of Japan copying Britain's homework, and that's not a criticism, because what they did, they literally bought an old Elan, took it apart, analysed it in millimetric detail, and then, as the Japanese always do, found ways to make it better.
But why copy the Lotus Elan? Well, that's down to the founding genius behind it, Colin Chapman.
We built the engine onto the car, as you can see.
Yes.
And now we built the rest of the suspension on the back of the engine, because the engine itself is forming part of the structure of the car.
His engineering maxim was add lightness, and his fiberglass Elan was considered by many the ultimate driver's car. His motto has inspired generations of car designers ever since, including the legend behind the iconic McLaren B1, Frank Stephenson.
Colin Chapman was very well known or very famous for the saying, add lightness. I think it was a very smart way to design a car that really started a revolution of design principles and engineering principles that work to increase the advantages of a vehicle. I think it's easy to understand why the Japanese took the Lotus Elan as the inspiration for the new MX-5. It's definitely a car that says the same thing but speaks it in a different language. The MX-5 really does hit home those values of fun driving, of convertible driving, of lightweight, of response, of suspension. I think all those values are a modern version today of what the Elan could have evolved into.
Launched in 1989, the MX-5 was an instant success and flew out of the showrooms. It took just 27 years to sell 1 million units, half the time in a Porsche 911, and part of that appeal was the reliability.
You don't become the greatest selling roadster of all time for no reason. And when have you ever seen an MX-5 broken down? You haven't. Why? Because they're reliable. In fact, they're reliable, great handling, economical, usable.
We got pretty close to making the perfect little two-seater sports car.
So there's a lot to love about the MX-5, but it does have one slight issue. Its image problem.
It really annoys me that people call the MX-5 a hairdresser's car. If they're calling it that, they've never driven one and they've not experienced how great it is. And it makes you a better driver because they're a little bit feisty.
It is a hairdresser's car, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people say it, but what they mean is it looks slightly effeminate, and the kind of car that people who aren't moved by masculine-looking sports cars will enjoy. And if that's hairdressers, then so be it.
This is a car that's reputation made me not want to like it. I saw it as something a hairdresser used to get to work, and then I went and drove it. And what a gorgeous little car. It's got a sharp little gear change. It just handles so responsively.
Jimmy surprised me because all this time he was taking the mick out of me for driving an MX-5, and he's a fan. So I'm never going to let him live this down.
The MX-5, winning over the skeptics and selling millions. We're one entry away from crowning the best sports car ever. We've seen stunners from the 50s and 60s and covered the rest of the 20th century and even into the 21st. So, what's left?
Nothing. We're done. Let's have the vote.
Not quite Cowland. One more made the shortlist, and it's the godfather of them all, the Alfa Romeo 6C. The 6C Alfa Romeo, it was a car that you could finally go fast round corners in, so it felt sporty, and it was a car. So that's where we get sports car. Alfa Romeo were at the top of motorsport in the mid-1920s. They had a certain Enzo Ferrari in their team and had won the World Championship in 1925. So they tapped into that racing pedigree and used their technical knowledge. Then, in 1927, launched this gorgeous dual-purpose car as adept on public roads as it was on the track.
Come on, that is a refined, beautiful, beautiful thing. This is a moment I wish I could do an Italian accent.
With the Alfa Romeo 6C, back in the 20s, they absolutely nailed it. It was incredibly stylish and the perfect balance between form and function, which is everything a sports car should be.
Do you know when your cat sort of springs itself back and goes all taut and is just about to jump forward? That's what it looks like stood still. That's clever to do in metal.
The person responsible for creating the 6C sports car actually started off as a truck mechanic. Vittorio Jano, the son of Hungarian immigrants, and it turned out he was a natural genius of car engineering. At just 32 years old, he became the chief engineer at Alfa Romeo. Vittorio was a visionary. He took the DNA of their racing cars and transplanted it into the sensational 6C. A sports car for the road. Alfa Romeo are very much a racing team that developed road cars. You know, they didn't just start making boxy saloons like Henry Ford did. No, they went racing first of all, and then the people that raced their cars wanted to use one to drive in the week. So they started to develop their race cars for the road. The 6-seat referred to Jano's 6 cylinders, and over a number of years, more and more beautiful versions were released. But it was the Alfa Romeo 6-seat 1750 SS which stood out. But all the models were classics.
You could drive it to a racetrack, race it, you're probably going to win, and you will look like the king of the world on the way there while you're winning and on your way back with your prize next to you. It had it all.
In 1930, the 6-seat did enter races, finished and won pretty much every one of them, including the fabled Mille Miglia, that 1,000-mile road race. But back then, the tyres were skinnier, the brakes were more primitive, the roads were more dangerous, and the drivers, well, they risked their lives to win.
Probably the most famous story was Tasio Novellari in the Mille Miglia. He played a bit of a game on his rival Vasi at the time. It was pitch dark, and he decided the only way he was going to win this race was by playing a trick, and that was to turn the headlights off at over 90 miles an hour. So let's keep in mind, they had no seat belts. I mean, the safety parameters of the cars were pretty much zero. It seems completely bonkers, but that's what he did. He turned the headlights off, he followed Vasi along, and right towards the end of the race, he turned the lights on, snuck past to win the race. An extraordinary story.
The incredible 6Cs lasted 27 years, cost twice the price of a house, and evolved from a raw sports car into a sleek GT. Little surprise, it was seen as a symbol of Italian engineering supremacy by Benito Mussolini. Now, they're still twice the price of a house, as long as your house is a palace.
They're not cheap, and good things cost a lot of money. They go to the people who really understand this. So if you understand, fine wines, good food, if you understand art, wonderful music, it's an appreciation of a car. You could sit and just stare at it.